Part 1 of Cecil's Own Book by Anne Hawkshaw. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Cecil's Own Book by Granny, Mrs. Hawkshaw. Printed for private circulation, 1871. To the memory of Mary, mother of Cecil. The Wonderful Adventures of Hasan the Younger, the son of Hasan al-Alfi, the camel driver. When the Caliph Omar reigned in Baghdad, there lived by the wells of Musa a certain camel driver called Hasan al-Alfi, who had 7 sons, and the youngest was named Hasan the Little, or Hasan the Younger, to distinguish him from his father. The 6 elder sons went long journeys with their father across the desert, but the little Hasan went not, but remained at home with an old woman who had been his nurse, and he played in the garden by the fountains, and amused himself on the seashore, gathering shells, of which there were many of strange shapes and of most beautiful colours. One day when his father and brothers were absent, the old woman said to Hasan, "I must go away for 2 days to buy some clothes of which I am in need. Go not away to the seashore, but stay in the house and the garden, for it may happen that thy father and thy brothers may return in my absence, and if they come back and found no one to prepare them food, they would be greatly displeased." So Hasan promised the old woman he would remain in the garden till she returned. So she departed, taking a bottle of water to drink and some dates to eat on her journey, and Hasan sat down under the tall palm trees by the side of the large fountain to read in the Koran, for his father would not allow his sons to remain ignorant of the arts of reading and writing. When he had finished reading, he looked up, and to his great astonishment he saw an old man standing by the fountain, for he had heard no one come up to the garden. The old man had a long white beard that reached down to his girdle. His dress was a long linen tunic fastened with a leather belt, from which hung a small red earthen dish, like a little shallow basin. He had in one hand a bottle made of the same sort of red earth, and in the other a long bamboo stick on which he leaned heavily, as if he had walked long in the desert and was weary. Now Hasan knew at once that he was a holy man who had been a pilgrimage to the tomb of the Prophet, and he laid aside his book and rose up from under the trees where he had been sitting, and saluted the old man by bowing down with his face to the ground, and said, "My father, will you drink of the waters of Musa, and repose under the aged palm trees where our great ancestor Ishmael hath sat?" And the old man replied, "I will, my son." Then Hasan spread a mat under the tree, and fetched water from the well, and hastened and put dates and oranges and custard apples in a basket made of palm leaf, and strewed sweet-scented henna flowers over them. And when he had brought them to the pilgrim, he said, "Eat, my father, and leave a blessing on the house of Hasan al-Alfi, even the blessing of one who hath prayed at the tomb of the Prophet. Praised be Allah." For so he had been taught by his father to welcome all holy men when they came to drink of the wells of the desert. So the old man ate and drank and lay down and slept under the cool shade of the palm trees, overcome by the fatigue of his long journey and by the heat of the day, for the sky was without a cloud and of the colour of burnished copper, and the fierce heat of the sun was like the heat of a great oven, and the long leaves of the palm trees moved not, for there was not a breath of air to stir them, and the sweet scented flowers drooped as if they were dying, and the bundles of hay ready for the camels when they came home were dry as the shavings of wood, and the sand of the desert that surrounded the gardens and the wells glistened and shone in the glare of that terrible noonday heat. Even the lizards clung to the mud walls, silent and sleepy, and did not run nimbly about and in and out of the cracks as if they were playing at hide and seek with one another, as is the wont of lizards to do. There was not a sound of man or beast, or bird or insect, wind or water, for the silence was complete. All things seemed burnt to brick and baked into hardness, and Hasan, as well as the old man, overpowered by the heat, slept till the sun began to go down in the west, and a breeze began to stir the branches of the trees, and the flowers revived in the pleasant coolness. Then Hasan awoke and looked to see if the pilgrim was sleeping, but lo, he was gone. But on the mat where he had slept were 2 leather bags tied with strings. Then Hasan got up with haste and ran round the garden and looked in the garden house built by the great fountain, but he could not find the old man. Then he climbed to the top of a tall tree from which he could see for miles into the desert, but he saw nothing but a great dust, which he knew must be caused by a troop of camels. And he rejoiced at the sight, and his heart was glad, for he thought it must be his father and brothers who were coming home. So he came down quickly and prepared the hay for the camels to eat and water for them to drink, and spread a mat for his father and got ready food for supper. And when all things were in a state of readiness, he remembered the bags that the old man had left, and opened one to see what was in it. And when he had looked into it, he was amazed, for it was full of pieces of gold. Then he opened the other, and behold, it was full of diamonds and rubies and emeralds. Then Hasan clapped his hands and danced round the bags with delight, and cried, "I will go to Baghdad, and live as doth the Weezer of the Caliph, and wear a robe of silk, and drink sherbet out of a golden cup." Then he took out some of the diamonds and rubies and emeralds, and admired greatly their beautiful colours, and held up the diamonds to the light to see how they glittered. And whilst he was searching amongst them, he saw there was a piece of paper with some words written thereon, and looking with attention he perceived that it was addressed unto himself. For on the outside was written, in beautiful Arabic writing, "To Hasan the Little, the son of Hasan al-Alfi." Then he unrolled the paper, and then he saw that there was more writing inside. And he composed himself attentively to read, and the words were as follows: "The blessing of the old man, even the aged pilgrim from Mecca, who was wearied with journeying and fainting for lack of bread and of water, and who drank of the wells of Musa, and eat of the fresh dates of the garden, and slept safely under the palm trees in the hot noontide, rest on the house of Hasan al-Alfi, and a double blessing rest on the head of Hasan the Little, for he reverenced the aged man, even the aged pilgrim from Mecca, and made obeisance unto him, and tended him like a son. Now the old man, believing that the boy Hasan is one in whose heart dwelleth truth, leaveth in his care 2 leather bags filled with precious treasure, until he cometh again to claim them. And at the time appointed by Allah he will come again and ask of Hasan the Little to deliver up the gold and the gems. He also giveth to Hasan a ring that is sewed up in a small bag of silk of Damascus, which is concealed at the bottom of the bag of gold. Praised be Allah!" Now when Hasan had read these words, he emptied the bag of gold onto the mat, and found at the bottom a small silken bag such as the writing had described, and it was carefully sewed up. Then he took from his belt a knife and cut the stitches, and there appeared at the bottom of the bag a ring. Then Hasan took out the ring, and behold, it was but a ring of copper, and he threw it down on the ground and said, "It is but a ring of copper, such as the very water carriers of Cairo would not gather out of the dust." And when he looked at the gold and the precious stones, he despised the copper ring and left it lying on the ground, and sat silent and sad. Now near him was a henna tree covered with white sweet-scented blossoms, and a bird of dull plumage that had no beauty came and perched upon the branches and began to sing. And it sang these words to the great astonishment of Hasan, as he sat with all the treasure of the sacks poured out around him, and the ring thrown down on the mat. "Look not upon the treasure, Hasan. Hide it quickly from thy sight. Watch me as I float away far above these realms of night. Homeliest things are not the meanest, and the dull can change to bright. Watch me as I float away to the skies of pearly light." After that the bird with the dusky wings flew away, and as it flew far away it seemed to Hasan no more a bird, but a peri with wings of gold and azure. Then Hasan arose before the words of the wonderful creature had escaped his memory, and gathered all the gold and the precious stones, and put them into the bags, and tied them with the strings, and sat down on the mat. But he was sad, and sighed frequently, and said, "Of what use is all this treasure to an old man whose time on this earth will be short, and whose days are spent in pilgrimage to the holy places, and in ceaseless prayers to Allah, and that bread and water sufficeth for food? I will take the bags and hide them in the earth, and when some weeks have passed by, and my father and my brothers are about again to depart, I will secrete some of the treasure in my belt, and I will go with them, and when I reach some great city, I will leave my father and my brothers, and will sell the precious stones, and buy silk robes, and a palace like the palace of the Weezer. And no one will know, and when I want more money, I will return hither secretly, and take more of the treasure." And he rose and prepared to carry away the bags and hide them. But again he heard words come from the henna tree, and he stopped and beheld, and there sat a bird of the most brilliant plumage in the branches. Its wings glittered like the jewels in the turban of the Caliph, and Hasan was astonished at its great beauty, and it said, "Take the treasure, take it, Hasan. It will make thee rich and great. There is no one here to see thee. I will not the deed relate. Am I not of wondrous beauty? Wouldst thou like to share my fate? Take the treasure, seize it quickly, and for ever be my mate." Then Hasan began to dig a hole to bury the bags, and while he did so, he thought he heard a laugh of derision from the glittering creature, and he was afraid and trembled exceedingly, for he knew he was doing an evil deed in taking the treasure of the old man to be his own. Now it was the hour of sunset, and he remembered he had not washed, so he put down the bags and washed in the well, and spread his carpet, and knelt down to pray, with his face towards Mecca. And as he prayed, the bird changed its form, and became a loathsome creature, with wings like a bat, and long sharp claws on its feet, and round staring eyes that were like sparks of fire, that scorched Hasan as he looked at it, and its voice became like the voice of the cruel hyena of the desert, and Hasan was terrified beyond measure, and he said, "I will not take the treasure of the old man. I will only take the ring that he gave me, and the blessing he inscribed on the paper will rest on me, and on the house of my father." And he sought for the ring, and put it on the forefinger of his right hand. And when he did so, the ugly creature gave a loud scream, and flew away, and Hasan shuddered with exceeding fear. Then he took the bags into the garden house, and sat down to wait till his father and brothers should arrive, and his heart was at peace. And now outside the hedge of the garden he heard the loud voices of men, and the voices were not the voices of his brothers, but those of strangers, and their words were violent, and they uttered not the name of Allah, and Hasan was afraid, and he sat still on the mat and trembled. Then 6 men entered the garden, and took the hay and the water that Hasan had prepared for his father's camels, and gave them to their own camels. And when they had taken the loads off the beasts, they left them fastened to a palm tree outside the garden, and came themselves to the place where Hasan sat. Now they were fierce robbers from the desert, who feared not Allah, and had no pity on any living thing. When they saw Hasan, they said, Oh, here is a slave who will procure us food and water, for doubtless he hath them by him. For is not this the house and garden of Hasan al-Alfi, the rich camel-driver, whom we robbed on the way to Baghdad?" Then he who was the chief said to Hasan the Little, "Rise and bring us quickly some food and water, and spread mats under the trees, for we will rest and eat in this place, and afterwards thou shalt go with us, and be our slave and attend to the camels." Then poor Hasan the Little rose trembling, and went to fetch water and food, and he wept and said, "Alas, alas, I shall see my father and my brothers no more, but must be a slave to the robbers of the desert." And he wrung his hands and wept bitterly. But the men had no pity on him, but said, "If thou makest not haste, O slave, we will beat thee as the carpets are beaten in the palace of the Caliph." Now one of the robbers went into the garden house to see if there he could find clothes or money to carry away. And as he was searching, he espied the 2 bags that Hasan had put on the divan, and he took them and carried them to the other robbers under the palm trees. And they said, "Oh, what have we here? What hath this boy hidden in these leather bags that are so carefully tied up?" And when they had opened them and saw the treasure, they rejoiced excessively, and said, "This exceedeth all the treasure we have taken from the caravans this year." Then the Sheikh said, "Tie up the bags, and tomorrow when we rest at noon I will divide the gold and the precious stones, to each his right proportion, but the boy I will keep to be my slave." When Hasan heard these words, he fell on his face and entreated them not to carry him away, nor to take the bags, and he told them the whole story about the old man, and he showed them the writing to prove that he spoke words of truth. And they read the paper and saw that it was as he had said. Then they laughed and mocked at Hasan, and said, "Let us look at this ring." And when they saw it, they laughed yet the louder, and the Sheikh said, "Thou mayest keep thy copper ring, for it is fit only for the finger of a slave. But we will have the bags, and I will keep the writing, for it may be a charm of great value, as is the writing of a dervish." And when Hasan entreated them to have pity on him, they beat him with a bamboo cane, put him into the garden house, and fastened the door. And he wept all night, and could not sleep, and continually lamented, and said, "Oh, my father, oh, my brothers." And as he sat weeping and lamenting, behold, the ring came off his finger, and it rolled along the floor, and as it rolled, it grew bigger and brighter, till it shone like molten iron, and grew yet larger and larger, and then it fell over, and Hasan was sitting in the centre of the great circle that it made. And it appeared like fire all around him, but it scorched him not. And outside the circle of fire he saw the vile creature that tempted him to take the bags, and also evil genii, and ugly crawling creatures, and loathsome animals that tried to get at him, but they could not because of the wonderful belt of flame that surrounded him. So after a time they fled away, and when they were gone, the ring shrunk again to its former size, and appeared but as a ring of copper. And Hasan took it up and put it on his finger, and said, "Doubtless this ring hath wonderful properties, and is a talisman of great value. Praised be Allah!" And he rejoiced that the robbers had despised it, and that they had left it with him. And after that his heart was less sorrowful, and he slept and was refreshed. Now early in the morning the robbers unfastened the door of the garden house, and called to Hasan to come out and to load the camels. And when all was ready, they took the 2 bags of treasure and departed. The Sheikh rode on a fleet dromedary, and he made Hasan lead the camels that were laden with water, for they had filled all their water-skins with the sweet water from the wells of Musa, for they were going many days' journey into the desert, where they would find no water, nor grass nor herbs, save the bitter herbs of the wilderness that no man can eat. They took the way to the Red Sea, and at noon they stopped to shelter from the extreme heat of the sun under a great rock, and the camels lay down to rest. Then the Sheikh said, "Bring the sacks, and I will divide the gold and the precious stones." And Hasan was compelled to bring them. And they opened first the sack that contained the gold, and lo! instead of gold it was filled with sand. Then they opened the other that contained the diamonds and the emeralds and the rubies, and lo! they had been changed into little white and coloured pebbles, such as are on the seashore. Then the Sheikh said, "It is thou that hast done this, O Hasan the Little. Thou shalt die, thou deceitful and wicked slave, if thou dost not immediately reveal where thou hast hidden the treasure that was in these sacks yesterday." Then Hasan replied, "O my master, I know not how this hath taken place. I am ignorant of what hath become of the treasure." But they would not believe him, and were exasperated beyond measure, because the treasure was gone. So they took up Hasan and threw him into the sea, and he sank out of their sight in the clear water, and they left the bags under the rock and departed on their journey. Now Hasan at the first, when he was thrown into the sea, was stunned, and his mind was confused with fear. But after a while he found to his great joy and extreme wonder that he could live in the water as well as on the land. And he went down to the bottom of the sea, and it was as a lovely garden. The corals and the sea plants, amongst which the shining little fishes swam or rested, were beautiful to his sight, and the coolness of the water was refreshing to his heated limbs. And he said, "Praised be Allah, who hath bestowed on me this wonderful ring, for it is no doubt by its power that I have been preserved, and that I can live at the bottom of the sea. I will sit a while on this ledge of rock that looks like a couch, with a carpet of Ispahan spread over it. For this sea moss is beautiful as embroidered work from the looms of Iran, and I will watch the strange creatures of the sea as they swim about me." So he sat down on the rock, and the water was like a vault of emerald above him, and he saw the oysters opening and shutting their shells, and he saw the pearls glistening within them, and he watched the sea hedgehogs moving about, and he gathered shells of great beauty, such he had never found on the shore, whose colours were like the colours of the rainbow, in which one colour mingles with another. And Hasan said to himself, "This place is lovely as the gardens of Damascus, of which my father hath told me." Then he found a large shell that resembled a trumpet, and he put it to his mouth and blew into it, and it produced a sound like that of a silver trumpet, and he amused himself with blowing into it. But after he had amused himself so for some time, he heard a similar sound proceeding from a distance, and the sound came nearer and nearer, and he beheld a troop of creatures coming towards him. Their faces were beautiful as the moon, and their eyes lovely as the eyes of the gazelles in the desert, and their arms were fair as alabaster, but from their waist they resembled fishes. Now they were the sons and daughters of the old merman who lived in the cavern underneath the rock on which Hasan was sitting. They had heard the sound of the trumpet shell that he had been playing upon, and had come up to see who it was that had taken one of their instruments of music. "It may be," Hasan heard them say as they came on, "one of our cousins from Iran, who hath brought us the large pearls that our uncle promised us so long ago. Or perchance it is a messenger from the Sea King to inquire after the health of our father, for he is now the oldest and most venerated of all the sons of the sea." But when they saw Hasan, they were overcome with astonishment and wonder, and were silent from amazement. After a while they recovered from their great surprise and swam close up to him, and one of them said, "This is one of the strange creatures who live on the land, to whom Allah hath not granted a tail, but who move about on 2 pegs." And they began to laugh immoderately, and they said, "Let us take the tailless creature to our father. It will amuse him greatly to see him." Then one of them said to Hasan, "Canst thou speak, O thou tailless creature, or art thou dumb like the fishes? What is thy name?" Then Hasan said, "I am called Hasan the Little, and the name of my father is Hasan al-Alfi, the camel driver. And because of a charm I have about me, I can live in the water, and I will go with you, for though you are but sea monsters, and I am of the superior race of men, I think you are kind in heart and will not hurt me." Then they said, "No, we will not hurt thee." But they laughed excessively when they heard him call them sea monsters, and said, "This poor creature from the land hath not much intelligence, for he thinketh he is greater and wiser than the mermen, who have tails covered with shining scales of gold and green and azure. But Allah hath not granted to all creatures the same amount of sense, so we will have pity on him." When they saw Hasan stand on his 2 legs, they laughed again and said, "Do all the creatures on the land move as thou doest, on 2 pegs?" And Hasan answered, "No, some of them go on 4. And they laughed again, more immoderately, and said, "Certainly, the old man of the sea, who composeth the songs and the histories, never imagined any creatures so strange as these, of whom this mortal speaketh. And he hath lived for 1,000 years, and is the most learned of all the children of the sea. We think in this matter thou tellest not the truth, O Hasan the Little. But now we will go to our father, the old man of the sea." Then Hasan floated with them through the clear water till they came to a cavern, and they swam into it, and Hasan was oppressed and bewildered with the extreme beauty of the place when he examined it. There were on each hand 1,000 pillars of emerald that supported the roof, that was inlaid with the scales of gold and silver fishes curiously wrought together, and between each pillar was suspended a globe of pure white crystal, filled with the phosphorescence of the sea, which gave light to the hall of the 1,000 pillars. The floor was of pale pink coral, of the most delicate colour, and the divan was formed of mother of pearl, and on it reclined at the upper end of the hall the wise old man of the sea. Then the mermen and mermaidens brought Hasan to him, and said, "O our father, we have found this strange creature of the land, and have brought him, that thou mayest amuse thyself with him, and he shall tell us his history, though he is not beautiful to behold, and seemeth to lack intelligence." Then the old merman regarded Hasan and said, "Tell us thy story, and after I have heard thee speak, I can judge of thy sense." And Hasan told them all his history. He disguised nothing, and when he had finished, the old merman said, "I am the oldest son of the sea, yet I cannot decide whether the things thou tellest, O son of the land, are truth or falsehood. I will consider the matter for a whole moon, and thou shalt dwell here with my sons and my daughters, and no one shall say that thou art a liar, or shall mock thee." And his children were abashed before him, for they knew he was wise, with the wisdom of many years, and they were very young. Yet had they given an opinion immediately they had seen Hasan, that he was a creature of little sense, and spoke falsehoods. But their father had decided he must consider the subject for 1 whole moon, and they said one to another, "We will not laugh any more at the tailless creature, but will call him Hasan, as he saith that is his name." So they were kind to him, and his heart was at peace, and they showed him every day some new plant or new creature of the sea, and he was every day more astonished at the wonderful things he saw. And when a moon was nearly past, Hasan said to one of the maidens of the sea, who was the most loved of them all, "I wonder not, O dear maiden of the sea, that thy brothers believed in their hearts that I spoke falsehoods when I told them of the strange creatures of the land. For if anyone had informed me when I dwelt by the wells of Musa,
of the strange things that I see here day by day, I should have said that they spoke not the truth. I perceive that it becometh the young and the ignorant to be silent and to learn." Now at the end of a full moon, the old merman of the Hall of the Thousand Pillars sent for Hasan and said to him,
"O son of the land, I have pondered over thy words, and have observed thy deeds for one whole moon, and I am convinced that thou speakest the truth. So dwell with us as long as thou art content to do so, and tell us of the strange adventures that have come to thy knowledge respecting the children of the land."
So Hasan was glad that his words were believed, and he told them of his home by the wells of Musa, and of the beautiful things he had heard described by his friends who had visited strange countries. And when he had finished, some of the children of the sea sighed and said,
"It were better to live on the land than in the sea."
But the old wise man said,
"Allah, whose name be praised, hath appointed to all creatures the lot that is best for them, and a change will come for you, O you children of the sea."
Then the sea maiden, who was the best beloved, said, "Yes, O my father, we shall assuredly go to the Isle of the Sweet Fountains when the time that Allah hath appointed shall come." Now it came to pass that in 7 days the dear maiden of the sea, who was the most beloved, died, and they all lamented for her bitterly. And Hasan also, though he was not of their race nor of their kindred, wept for the loss of the maiden of the pure and loving heart. And the Hall of the Thousand Pillars became sad to him, and he wandered from it until he lost all means of finding his way back again, and he floated into the deep ocean and sank deeper and deeper into its silent and measureless abysses. And he became afraid as he went downward and downward into its silent depths. For as he descended lower and lower, all the beautiful things he had seen in the Hall of the Merman disappeared, and the silence and the solitude became insupportable to Hasan, and his heart became as a stone within him, as he sank deeper and deeper, and he said, "Perchance it is ordained that I am to live for ever amid these silent waters. Oh, would that I had died like the dear maiden of the sea." But his lamenting was of no avail, for he sank yet deeper and deeper, till at last his feet rested on a vast mountain that rose from the bottom of the nethermost ocean, and he was glad even of that change, though the mountain was full of deep pits and horrible caverns, and he would have rejoiced at the sight of the smallest fish, or of a piece of seaweed clinging to the rocks, but there was no living thing to be seen. But he said, "Perchance in that immense cavern that I see in the side of the mountain there may dwell some kind creatures of the race of the merman, who will direct me how to find my way to the land, for I wish now to return to my father's house." So he descended and looked into the cavern, and he could not move from the spot, but stood like one entranced, and his eyes were dilated with astonishment and wonder and fear. He saw that the cavern was of great extent, and was supported on pillars of adamant, and the floor and the roof were of marble, black as the night sky when no stars shine in it. To each pillar was a ring and an iron chain. At the further end of the cave was a door of open iron, curiously wrought with figures of a serpent, with a crown of gold and of carbuncles on his head. And through the open work of the door he saw another cave, more wonderful than the first. For in the middle was a fountain of fire, and the flames kept shooting upward and then falling down again like streams of liquid amber. And by the light of the fire fountain Hasan saw, reclining on a divan of black stone, the great sea serpent king. And he knew who he was, because the wise old man of the sea had spoken of him, but always with abhorrence, because he did evil to the mermen and enchanted them, and they avoided him and feared him greatly. Hasan could not see his great length, for he was coiled round and round till he formed as many circles as sailors make of 1,000 fathoms of cordage. But he saw that he had on his head a great crown of gold, and had round his neck a collar of carbuncles the size of ostrich eggs, and they glimmered and shone in the light of the fountain of fire. When Hasan had observed all these things, he said, "This is a vile place, and this is an evil-disposed creature. I will not tarry any longer near him, though I perceive that he is asleep now. But if he wakes, he may entrance me and turn me into a pillar of adamant. For now I see that all the pillars in this cave are in the likeness of living things of the sea or of the land, and doubtless by his magic he hath entranced them." So Hasan turned and fled quickly. Now as he was passing out, he saw that there were 2 strange sea monsters, chained by their necks to the 2 pillars nearest the entrance. And as he looked on them, he saw that they were weeping, and they opened their mouths as if they would fain speak to him, but they could not utter a sound. But they continued to gaze at him with eyes full of tears. Now Hasan was compassionate, and he said, "Who are ye?" But they only looked the more sorrowfully and beseechingly at him, but could not utter a word. Then Hasan perceived that they were dumb, but that they were not without intelligence, and he said, "I will at the least unchain them, and perchance they will find, by the mercy of Allah, some way out of their enchantment." So he went to the one on the right hand and undid his chain, and while he did so he touched the strange creature with his ring. And lo, it was changed immediately into a young merman. Then Hasan was glad, and unfastened the one on the left hand, and touched it also with his ring. And lo, it became a beautiful maiden of the sea, and they said, "O beneficent one, let us hasten away from this abominable cave. Praised be Allah, who hath had pity on us and sent thee to deliver us, for we have been enchanted for many years, and hope of deliverance had died in our hearts." So they and Hasan went out of the cave and began to float upward through the waters, but they grew weary and decided to rest. So they reposed on a ledge of the great mountain, at the foot of which was the hall of adamant. And while they reclined on the rock, Hasan said, "Tell me your adventure, O ye children of the sea, and by what misfortune ye became enchanted." And they replied to him, "O good creature of the land, we are of the children of the sea who dwell in the Gulf of Oran, and our home is in the palace of pearl, for it is built of mother of pearl that glistens in the clear waters with the colours of the rainbow, and it is surrounded by a grove of pink coral, beautiful to behold. Now it happened by the disposal of Allah, whose name be praised, that our father said, 'Take these pearls to our cousins, the children of the old man of the sea, who dwelleth in the hall of the 1,000 pillars.'" Then Hasan interrupted them and said, "My heart is glad, and I rejoice greatly that I have delivered you from your enchantment in the hall of the Serpent King, for you are the relations of those whom I respect greatly, and with whom I have dwelt more than 1 whole moon. But proceed with your adventures, for I would fain hear them to the conclusion." "O benevolent stranger," they said, "we took the pearls from our father, and we replied, 'O father, to hear is to obey.' But when we had left him and were swimming on to the hall of the 1,000 pillars, we said to each other, 'What use is it to go directly to the old man of the sea? Let us amuse ourselves by going downwards to see what things and creatures are in the abysses of the great ocean, for doubtless they are many and wonderful to behold.' But alas, after a time we lost all power over our motions, and were drawn down rapidly with great force till we reached the hall of adamant, and were drawn by enchantment into it, and up to the place where reclined the Serpent King of the sea. And he hissed at us and said, 'O disobedient children of the sea,
Ye are in my power now, and I will enchant you, and ye shall lose all that is beautiful about you, and become monsters."
Then we feared greatly and wept, but he only laughed and hissed at us, and he looked at us with his red fiery eyes. We felt ourselves changed into the ugly creatures thou sawest, O good stranger, and then he chained us to the pillars at the entrance of the cave, and the power of speech was taken from us. We could only weep and lament our fate in our hearts, for it was not in the power of the evil serpent king to change our minds. And though we could not utter words, we could pray to Allah in our thoughts, and entreat him to have compassion on us. But our hearts grew every moon more sorrowful, and we despaired of deliverance, when thou camest and released us. O beneficent stranger, wilt thou tell us thy name, that we may retain it for ever in our memories, and inscribe it on the most honourable place of the Palace of Pearl?" And he said, "My name is Hasan the Little, the son of Hasan el-Alfi, the camel-driver of the wells of Musa." And they replied to him, "During the whole of our existence we will not forget thee, O Hasan, for the ungrateful are an abomination to Allah." Then they proceeded upwards, and at last the children of the sea uttered a cry of joy and said, "We know that we are not far from our home, for these rocks are familiar to us." And they parted from Hasan with many kind words and thanks, and he continued his way towards the shores of Arabia. It was at the time of sunset when he came to the top of the sea, and he saw at a little distance from him an island beautiful as the gardens of paradise. At first he thought it was only the reflection of the gold and purple and rose colours of the sky which made the appearance of a glorious island of light in the clear waters of the sea, but as he considered it with attention, he became convinced that it was the island of the sweet fountains that the dear maiden of the sea loved to converse about. And he said, "I will go and examine more nearly the island of beauty and loveliness that Allah hath placed in the sea." And he drew near and landed in a garden where all the flowers of the world were blooming, and where the sound of fountains that fell into marble basins curiously carved, and the murmuring of running streams were heard perpetually. And Hasan's heart was dilated with joy at the sight of the garden, and he said, "I will repose here one night before I proceed to my father's house. I am astonished that I never heard from any of the dwellers by the wells of Musa of this beautiful island, for it seemeth to me very nigh to the land of the sons of Ishmael." And it was even so, but to the generality of persons it only appeared as the colours of the sunset, and they passed it by with indifference. So Hasan wandered about the garden, and drank from the fountains, and lay down to sleep. And when he awoke from a sweet and refreshing slumber, the full moon was shining, and he looked up, and lo, beside him stood a beautiful creature of the children of the genii. Her eyes were like the eyes of the gazelle of the desert, and her form was like the palm tree in its beauty and grace. And Hasan arose and bowed with his face to the ground and made obeisance, for he was overwhelmed with astonishment and wonder and reverence. Then he heard a voice, sweet as the wind of the south through the curves of a seashell, that said, "Hasan, son of Hasan el-Alfi, dost thou not know me?" And he gazed on the beautiful genie, and he knew in his heart that it was the dear maiden of the sea whom he had loved so much when he lived in the Hall of the Thousand Pillars. Now she was changed into wondrous beauty and loveliness, but it was only the change from the seed to the full-grown flower. So Hasan knew her to be the same dear maiden who had been so kind to him before she was changed, and became one of the genii of the island of sweet fountains. And his heart was filled with joy that found no words to express itself. So he only gazed at her with pleasure in his eyes, and with his hands clasped in reverence, for he felt he was in the presence of a being greatly superior to himself, and he remembered with shame how often he had despised the discourse he had heard from her of the things that would be in the island of the sweet fountains, to which she always said she should go after her life as a maiden of the sea had finished. For the words had seemed to him but as fables. Now he bowed before her and was silent. Then she smiled on him and said softly, "I know what thou hast done for the disobedient children of the sea, whom thou hast released from a long enchantment. The blessing of Allah, whose name be praised, be on thee, Hasan. And now thou must return to thy father's house, and perform all the duties that pertain to thy station as the son of the good camel-driver Hasan al-Alfi, whose misfortunes have been many and grievous. And when thy task is completed, thou wilt see me again." Then Hasan found words to speak and said, "O beautiful daughter of the genie, cannot I benefit thee in some measure? Can I not go to the Hall of the 1,000 Pillars and bring thee tokens of the welfare of thy father and of those whom thou lovest?" Then replied the lovely child of the genie, with a smile that made the heart happy as a ray of sunshine maketh gladsome a dark cavern, "It is good that thou hast thought of this, O Hasan, but I need it not. Every day I see them and know of their welfare. For when the last ray of the sun toucheth the sea, I go down upon it and visit my kindred. They are not aware of my presence, for so Allah hath decreed, except that they feel in their hearts an ineffable calm, for which they can assign no reason. And I shall watch over them till the time that is fixed shall come, and they too shall join me in the island of the sweet fountains, and the time will not be long." When she ceased speaking, Hasan felt a wonderful drowsiness come over him, and he fell into a deep sleep. How long he slept he never could discover, but when he awoke it was noonday, and he was laid under the rocks where the robbers had examined the sacks and found them full of stones and sand, and where they had determined to throw Hasan into the sea. And now when he had opened his eyes, behold, he saw the 2 sacks beside him, and he was overwhelmed with astonishment, and said, "The beautiful child of the genie hath conveyed me hither during the night. Now I will return immediately, as she desired me to do, unto the wells of Musa, and serve and comfort my father." And he prepared to depart, when lo! he saw before him the aged pilgrim who had given him the ring and the bags. So he bowed to the ground and said, "I have nothing to offer thee, holy dervish, not even a cup of water, for my adventures have been strange since I entertained thee at my father's house, and I am straitened in my heart because I have not fulfilled the trust thou gavest to me. Here are the bags committed to my keeping, but they are filled with sand and pebbles." Then the old man touched the bags with his staff and said, "Open the bags, O Hasan the Little, and let us see the change that has befallen the treasure." So Hasan opened them, and they were filled with gold and diamonds and rubies and emeralds as before, and he was silent with wonder and joy. Then he said, "I restore to thee, O holy pilgrim, that thou leftest with me, and I thank thee above all for this wonderful talisman that thou gavest me, which has been the means of teaching me many things I should not have discovered without it." Then the dervish said, "I give thee the sacks of treasure, but thou must give me the ring, for I need it to give to others of thy age who require to be taught as thou hast been." So Hasan took the copper ring from his finger and gave it to the dervish, and he blessed him and departed, and Hasan saw him no more. Then Hasan took a few pieces of gold from one of the sacks and put them in his sash, and he hid the bags of treasure in a hole in the rocks, and departed to the house of his father. And the way was toilsome over the hot sand of the desert, and when he arrived he found no one there, and the garden was overrun with weeds, and the channels for the water round the garden of herbs was dry, for no one had replenished them from the well since he had been taken away by the robbers. And the fence was broken down, and the ripe dates were dropping from the trees, for there was no one to gather them. The only thing that remained unchanged was the great well, for the water still bubbled up in it and ran over the side of the basin into a little canal it had made for itself. And along the side of this channel the flowers and the trees were green and beautiful. So Hasan drank of the water, and did eat of the fruit, and was refreshed, and lay down to rest in the garden house. Now Hasan arose as soon as it was day, and began to draw water and pour it into the channels to refresh the trees and the herbs. And while he was at work, a family came by of poor Arabs who had been robbed of all they possessed by the Bedouins of the desert. And the father and his 3 sons asked charity of Hasan in the name of Allah, and he gave them some more dates to eat, and gave them water from the well. And then he said, "Be content to abide here, and to assist me to restore the garden to its former state of usefulness and beauty, and I will pay you with liberality for your work, for I am desirous to have it in order before the return of my father, who hath long been absent. And I too, though I am so young, have had strange adventures, and have been far away from this place where I was born. Perchance some day, if ye consent to dwell with me, I may tell you of the wonderful events that have occurred to me." Then the men rejoiced and said, "We will stay and work for thee, O master, and thou shalt pay us for our labour." Then the work of restoring all things to perfection proceeded rapidly, and after a while Hasan went to the place where he had hid the sacks, and took out more gold, and bought camels and sheep, and carpets to cover the divans, and made all ready to receive his father and his brothers. But they came not, neither had he any tidings of them, and he went out and sat down in the desert and wept and said, "Alas, my father! Alas, my brothers!" And as he sat and lamented, there came to him a poor man whose robe was torn and tattered, and whose face betokened hunger and sickness. But he no sooner saw Hasan than he cried out, "O Hasan, my son!" And he embraced him, and they wept for joy, for it was Hasan al-Alfi, the father of Hasan the Little. Then he reverently led his father home, and brought him water to wash, and took off his soiled robe, and put on him one of silk, and made him recline on the divan. And the servants came and served him with food and sherbet. When he was refreshed, Hasan inquired respecting the welfare of his brothers, and his father answered, "Alas, my son, we have been robbed of all we possessed, and thy brothers were compelled to hire themselves as servants to a rich merchant of Baghdad. But I was too old to work, so they gave me some water and food for my journey, and I have with great toil and labour travelled home, and I am greatly astonished at all the abundance and beauty that I see around me, and I know not from whence it hath come." Then Hasan the younger told his father of all his strange adventures, and the night was far advanced before he had narrated them all. Then they praised Allah and lay down to sleep. On the morrow Hasan sent 2 of the servants with camels and gold and jewels to Baghdad for his brothers, that they might be relieved from their servitude. And at the end of 2 moons they returned, and there was rejoicing in the house of Hasan al-Alfi, such as had not been remembered by any man that dwelt by the wells of Musa. End of Part 1. Part 2 of Cecil's own book,
by Anne Hawkshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Selfish Toad. There was once an old toad lived under a stone. He had lived there for years, all alone, all alone. Sometimes he went out to look for a dinner. He knew when the time came because he was thinner. So when he had eaten a few worms and snails, he quickly munched them up, heads, bodies and tails. He slowly crawled back to his home by the stone, and said,
"It is pleasant to live here alone. I've no one to tease me, and no one to feed. To live all for oneself is a very good creed. There's that drudge of a field mouse, with 6 babies to keep. I wonder if ever she gets a night's sleep. I wish that their house was away from my door. They're squeaking for breakfast when I want to snore. And there are the bees, the ridiculous things, always working and buzzing and shaking their wings. I have got an attack of the nerves with their humming. It's almost as bad as the woodpeckers drumming. All around me is ever this worry and din. Then I live in a fright that my floor will fall in. For Engineer Mole, with his sharp scratching claws, is making a tunnel right under my paws."
Just then a small voice from underground said, "Good morrow, old grumbler, I'm under your bed. When you miscall your neighbours, so loudly don't speak. I have very good hearing, though my sight's rather weak." He had scarcely done talking when down from the hill came sliding some gravel, and when it stood still, it had filled up the doorway of Mr. Toad's house, and fastened him in as a trap holds a mouse. He panted and struggled, and thought he must die, when up came the Mole at his piteous cry.
"Oh dear, Mr. Mole,"
said the Toad with a groan,
"can you tunnel away from under this stone?"
"Oh, ow, ow," said the Mole, "you are growing polite when you want me to help you here out of your fright. I've heard that your people can live in a stone. You would like that, no doubt. You like living alone."
"Oh dear, Mr. Mole, don't stand talking, but try to make a hole out, or I surely shall die."
"Well, well," said the Mole, "I will do what I can," and to scratch a way out in right earnest began. And after a great deal of panting and puffing and squeezing and groaning and sighing and huffing, the Toad made his way through the dark narrow hole, and waving his paw said,
"Oh dear, Mr. Mole, you're the cleverest and kindest of creatures I know. I wish I had more than mere thanks to bestow. But one thing I've learnt, it's a good thing to work, and never a neighbourly action to shirk. And the field mice may squeak, and the bees they may hum, and you may make tunnels, and I will be dumb."
The Discontented Stream. Far away, amid the mountains, underneath an aged thorn, mid a tuft of emerald greenness, once a tiny stream was born. With no noise it bubbled upward, then it gently slid away, hollowing out its rocky channel through long ages day by day. Sometimes round the stones it fretted, turning, twisting here and there, sometimes over pebbles rippling, making them as jewels fair. Then again 'twas almost hidden by the heather and the fern, and the shy birds of the moorland drank from out the tiny burn. Wider grown through fields it wandered, and beside its grassy edge the reed warblers built their nests among the bulrush and the sedge. Underneath moss-covered bridges, past the village and the farm, still it hurried onward, onward, never resting, never calm. From its home amid the mountains, underneath the old thorn-tree, through the moorland and the meadow, on it went to find the sea. Thus for ages, long, long ages, it had wandered on its way, when one hot and sultry summer the reed warblers heard it say, ever flowing to the wild and solemn sea, am I never to be tranquil? All things seem to rest but me. I am weary of this movement, of this never-ceasing flow. I should like to stop and listen, or watch the flowers and rushes grow. Then a voice came murmuring softly from the willow overhead, think not of thy pleasure, streamlet. Thus the bending branches said, thou wert made for ceaseless motion, ever to the sea to tend. I was made, nor murmur at it, all my life o'er thee to bend. But the stream still murmured sadly, would, oh, would that I might rest. To lie stagnant, dull and weedy, streamlet, would not make thee blest, said the yellow glow flowers to it, as it hurried murmuring past. But the day so longed for, hoped for, to the streamlet came at last. It was turned into a hollow, banked and hidden from the view, and no more the waving willow or the wild flowers near it grew. It was still and black and silent, slimy weeds upon it spread, loathsome newts and tadpoles filled it, but fair creatures from it fled. Wicked jack-o'-lanterns loved it, and on dark and misty nights danced and gambolled round and o'er it with their false and flitting lights. And if poor benighted wanderers, thinking it was cottage fire, trusting followed the bad elfins, they were lost amid the mire. Noisome vapours o'er it hovered, and men shunned the doleful spot. Thus was lost the mountain streamlet that had murmured at its lot. End of Part 2. Part 3 of Cecil's own book by Anne Hawkshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Little Prince Bepettedbyall. Once upon a time there lived a little boy who was called Prince Bepettedbyall. His house was in one of the fairylands, for you must know that there are a great many fairylands besides that you read of in the dear old books that children love so much, all except those very dull boys and girls who can only read the very biggest fact print and can never look inside anything. Oh yes, there is the fairyland of the dear old books, where the trees are made of emeralds and the apples are gold, and where the lady fairies sleep on rose leaves, and the baby fairies swing in hammocks of gossamer, and the fairy soldiers have arms of thistledown and ride on dragonflies when they go to battle. Then there is the fairyland of the brave-hearted Northmen, where the palaces are built of glittering icebergs, and the little gnomes dig and hammer in the mines of silver and gold, and laugh and grin at any unlucky mortal who has strayed into their caverns, and threaten to pour molten metal down his throat, or to pinch off his nose with their hot tongs. All in joke, you know, for they are very good-natured little dwarfs after all, with their big heads and funny short crooked legs, at which they laugh themselves quite as much as they laugh at anybody else. Oh, they are merry mischievous little fellows, these gnomes of the northern mountains, and they watch year by year the beautiful metals and the glittering crystals as they grow deep down in the caverns of the rocks, and they dig them out and make jewels and drinking cups of them for the king of the gnomes, who lives in the middle of a mountain near the North Pole. And sometimes they make channels in the mountains and pour metal into them, and then if any men find it they dig it out, and are very glad they have discovered it. And one learned man says it was made so and so, and another learned man contradicts him and says,
"No, these rocks and metals have been made so and so."
And they get angry and quarrel about it. And all the time the little gnomes laugh and chuckle and say, "Listen to these mortals who think themselves so wise. What nonsense they talk, and how they quarrel and contradict each other. Sometimes when they are in a very good humour, they will take a pocket full of precious stones and pour them into a stream, or put them in a hole for some poor man to find and sell, to buy food for his little children. Oh, they are not bad fellows, the little crooked-legged gnomes. Another fairyland is the fairyland of the greedy children, where the houses are built of sugar candy, and the walls are of hardbake and butterscotch, and the trees are all of barley sugar, and the streams are ginger beer and cowslip wine, and the snow turns to whipped cream, and the rain to new milk. But that fairyland is very near the country of physic-cum-headache, a very ugly place indeed, where the sand is Gregory's powder, and the lakes are filled with black draught, and smell worse than the Thames or the Cam at Cambridge or the fountains in Kensington Gardens. Note, written before the improvements. And last of all, there is the country of all round about us, the most lovely of all the fairylands. Only so many people who live there are blind, and never see any of the beautiful things that surround them, or hear the sweet sounds that are for ever murmuring round them. For the winds make aeolian harps of the trees, and play, oh, such pleasant music on them. And the mountain streams do the same with the rocks they run over, and the flowers talk to each other, especially in an evening, just before they go to sleep in the twilight. The little blue forget-me-nots on the edges of the still calm lakes sing songs to the beautiful water-lilies as they float near them, and the words are about those who used to love them, perhaps most of all for their sweet name. And when the oldest, the pink ones, have sung a verse, all the young blue ones then join in a chorus and sing, "Forget-me-not, forget-me-not." And the water-lilies say, "No, we will not forget you, for you tell us of those who have passed away to the land of all blessedness, those who always understand the music of the fairyland in which they dwelt while here." And so they all talk about the things they like the best, and that they think the most about. And some are very merry, and sing such funny songs. But it is only the very good-tempered and happy children who can hear them. The red poppies throw their scarlet caps at the blue cornflowers when the harvest moon is shining bright and clear, and say, "Come, you little blue jokers, practise the harvest home song and let us have a night of it." And then they get so noisy, and play each other such jokes, that the grave ripe corn, especially the barley, which ought to be serious, you know, for it is bearded like a patriarch, can scarcely get any sleep. And then the trees and flowers and waters in the land of all round about us are so clever they always tell the tales and sing the songs that suit the people best who can hear them. I told you many people never can hear them, not in all their life, and will not believe that anyone hears them. I wonder if you will hear their pleasant talk. I hope so, for it is a great pleasure. Well, I was saying, they are so clever in always talking at the right time and about the right things. They never tell sad stories to happy little boys and girls, nor joking ones to those who are in sorrow. They speak gently, oh, so gently and sadly to those whose dear ones have gone away, and who will see them no more till after many tears have been wept. Nor do they tell laughing tales to those who are studying the nature of wonderful plants and rocks, and to some they sing grand hymns about the beginning of things, and to some they tell the story of the past, of the long ages gone, of that far-off time when monstrous creatures alone lived on this earth, and men there were none. But I was going to tell you about the little Prince Bepettedbyall, and instead of that I have been telling you about fairylands. So now I will begin again and tell you about him. Well, I think it must have been in the land of all round about us that he lived. He had a great many people to take care of him, as a little Prince Bepettedbyall was sure to have,
and better far than most little princes, he had a great many people who loved him. There were the 3 head gouvernantes, the first of whom was the Lady Cecilia, who saw that he was properly clothed and fed. He was never allowed to go into the land of greedy children to chip bits off the rocks of hardbake and break the branches of the sugar candy trees, because if he had, a creature all covered with black cloth, who drove about in a sort of chariot, would have carried him away to the land of physic cum headache, and perhaps have kept him there for several days, or even it might be weeks, for it is often very hard indeed to get away from that ugly country. She had also to watch lest the Ice King or the Frost Giant should touch him, and pinch his hands and feet till they were stiff and red, which they will do if they can catch little children out of doors at Christmas without their warm gaiters and mittens on. And if the North Wind, or his worst brother the East Wind, came hallooing by, frightening all the poor little spring flowers that had just peeped out of the ground to look at the sun and say, "Good day, little Bepettedbyall," Lady Cecilia would say, "You must ride on your rocking horse today, and I will tell you stories, but you must not go out to fight with the North Wind. Why, he has just come back from freezing the sea for the Ice King at the North Pole, and getting his fleet of icebergs ready for him to sail down and crush the whale ships. Once they nearly crushed to pieces the ship in which one of your uncles was going to a country a long way from here. So we do not like the Ice King's fleet, though they are beautiful to look at." Then there was the Lady Bien-Aimée, who taught him what things he might play with and what things he was not to touch, and soon he learnt to know that he was not to take the king his father's books off the shelves in the library, and build houses of them as he did with his wooden bricks. And she taught him too not to begin to scream when he saw the sous-gouvernante, Manennetta, descend the staircase to conduct him to his own apartments. The Lady Rosina's principal duty was to play and sing to him when he was too tired to care for his toys. He had a wonderful animal on which he rode when the weather was fine. It had 4 legs and a long tail to switch off the flies, and soft short grey hair, and a brown mark across its shoulders, and rather long ears. I am obliged to say that it had not a pleasant voice, but Bepettedbyall was very fond of it, though sometimes, I'm sorry to say, if he had a cane in his hand, for he did not always carry a sceptre about with him as little princes do in the fairy lands of the dear old books. No, he only carried a cane, and sometimes he struck Aswolly, that was the animal's name, a sharp blow on its head that made it put its rather long ears down, and start off quite suddenly, so fast that Prince Bepettedbyall would fall upon its neck, and have to clutch at the housings that covered it, lest he should come tumbling down upon the ground. And you may imagine what a fright he looked, doubled up on Aswolly's back, like a bundle made of a pillow, and a hat and a jacket and a pair of boots. Then Lady Bien-Aimée would say to him, "You are justly punished for being so unkind, and I hope, whenever you are cruel as you were just now, that Aswolly will treat you in the same way." But I think he was not often unkind to anything, or the beautiful little creature with wings that lived in the grove near the palace would not have come to him. Yet it did so, and whenever he came near its home, it would spread out its pretty wings and come to look at him and speak to him. Its voice was very sweet, but he could not understand what it said, because it belonged to another world, not to his world, of which he had not yet learned the language, but he liked its pleasant voice. Sometimes he was taken for a short time to stay in the City of the World, an immense city, and containing more wonderful things than were to be found in the cities of the Arabian Nights. I think even Sinbad, who had seen so many strange places, would have been astonished if he had been taken by some djinn and put down in the middle of the City of the World, and would have exclaimed,
By Allah, this is wonderful. The noise of this multitude of people is like the sound made by the army of the king of the Jinns as they pass over the desert.
But the soft low voices of the land of all round about us are almost lost in the great sounds of that mighty city. And I think the little prince, when he was very young, liked better to be in his own fairyland, amongst the trees and flowers that he understood. I think this is all I can tell at present about Prince Bepettedbyall. He is now growing so tall that I fear he will soon have to leave his own pleasant land. And if he does, I hope he will go and live in the country that many of his relations inhabit, which is a very beautiful land too, and where he can listen to the stories that the rocks and the forests tell. End of Part 3. Part 4 of Cecil's Own Book by Anne Hawkshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Noontide Dream. A little child sat on the grass, and as he watched the shadows pass from the clouds above his head, softly to himself he said, "I do not like the shadows flitting o'er the place where I am sitting, chasing the sunbeams up the hill and making all so sad and chill. What were clouds made for, I wonder? Are they meant to hold the thunder, or palaces the Rain King makes, and the angry north wind breaks when the Ice King sends him forth from his snowlands in the north, where the walrus has its home and the savage white bears roam?" Softly to himself, thus talking, while the shadows danced and played, sleep came o'er him gently stealing on the time his head was laid, and 1,000 fairy faces that were ever changing places, dancing here and resting there, flitted round him, whispering wonders that they saw on land and sea, where Niagara foams and thunders. Thus they say, "At home are we, on the crest of ocean billows, on the dancing stream where willows in the summer noontide quiver, on the dewdrops of the morning that the gossamer hath strung, when the autumn day is dawning. We can dance, but if our king far away the clouds will fling, for we vanish one and all when cloud shadows o'er us fall. All the flowers our empire own, pale and colourless and weak, they will tell you they must be without us. Could you hear them speak? Listen, mortal child, and try to hear the voices passing by, voices that for ever sound all this wondrous world around." Then he saw them hand in hand on the bank beside him stand. One was clothed in robe of blue, another had the rose's hue, and for ever mixing, blending, each to each her colours lending, till at last they all were blent in one dazzling element. And they, smiling, sped away, and a warm and sunny ray woke the child from out his sleep that had been so soft and deep. The Squirrel That Forgot That It Would Be Winter. A story of Hollycombe in 1866. There was a little squirrel once lived in a tulip tree, as merry a little fellow as ever you did see. His tail was long and bushy, his fur was thick and soft, and he had a nest within a hole in the branches up aloft. All summer he had played about, and never food had wanted, though he did not meddle with the trees that grandpapa had planted. He did not nibble off the shoots of Dolly's cedar tree, or gnaw the Wellingtonia that dear Cecil's is to be, but he cracked the nice sweet beech nuts, and scampered o'er the grass, and gathered up the acorns brown. But then, alas, alas, he quite forgot that summer days and autumn nuts don't last, and quite forgot how he must live when the pleasant time was past. November days were short and chill, but yet upon the ground An acorn or a chestnut by searching well he found. But after that December came, and the wind sighed wild and drear. He listened, but no robin's song could little Frisky hear. Naught but the sighing of the wind, the leafless branches through, or the whirring of the pheasant cock, as past his hole it flew. Then Christmas came, and white and thick the snow lay on the ground, and not an acorn or a nut could anywhere be found. He tried to sleep, but in the morn a faint and sickly ray of sunshine crept into his hole, and told him it was day. So down the tree he slowly came, and crept along the snow, and o'er the lawn and o'er the fence to where the beech trees grow, beside the croquet ground, for there his cousin Flosky dwelt, and very humbly on the snow poor little Frisky knelt.
"I'm very hungry, cousin Floss, and you have such a store of nuts and acorns in your hole. Do let me have a score." "I'll pay them back next year, dear coz. I will indeed, and try not to forget in summer days how quickly they go by." When Flosky heard his cousin call, he never said a word, pretending to be fast asleep, and that he nothing heard. He crept down farther in his hole, among the nice warm hay, and thought, "I will not make a noise, and then he'll go away." Poor Frisky listened, but in vain. He pricked up both his ears. His heart grew very sad indeed. His eyes were full of tears. He wiped them with his furry tail, and then he said, "I'll try to find a bit of twig to eat. None can me that deny." So slowly o'er the fence he crept, and o'er the lawn again. He was so hungry and so cold, to walk was quite a pain. But Frisky, when he reached his home, screamed out in pure delight, and clapped his little paws, and danced, quite frantic with delight. For Bridger with his broom had swept a place quite clean and bare, and Grandpapa had put a heap of maize and barley there. He ate a little barley first, and then he tried the maize. "Oh dear," he said, "I have not had such food for many days." Then up into his hole he took a store to last till spring, when well he knew the buds would burst, and the little birds would sing, and the sunshine on the soft green leaves would play and rest by turn, and noiselessly unfolding too would grow the lady fern. "How good," he said, "it was to put that nice sweet food for me. I'll never nibble off a shoot again of any tree." The ambitious water lily. Once embosomed by high mountains, on which giant pine trees grew, lay a lovely quiet lakelet with its waters of deep blue. Waterfowl from many countries built their nests upon its shore, for by man 'twas unfrequented, nor disturbed by dipping oar. On one side high crags enclosed it, that the ivies clothed with green, and in every nook and crevice tufts of feathery fern were seen. Stones that centuries had rounded were upon the other hand, and like gold dust in the sunshine glittered the low banks of sand. There the bramble's shining berries and its graceful leaves were spread, while the hardy mountain ashes waved their branches overhead. But though mortal never crossed it, oft was seen a fairy boat, by the wild birds in the twilight o'er its stilly waves to float. In it stood a tiny lady. Not more beautiful than she were the daughters of the genii or the peris of the sea. Shining, glistening in the sunset, gleaming pale when moonlight fell, skimmed her pearly vessel onward, fashioned like an ocean shell. All things knew her, all things loved her, birds and wild flowers of the glen, all like her that lived with nature far away from haunts of men.
In the shallows of the lakelet was the water-lily's home. There for years had she been floating, and had never wished to roam. But one day she drooped in sorrow, closed her flowers, and sighing said, "Wasted life to dwell for ever on this lake's unnoticed bed. Lily of these lovely waters, art thou weary of thy lot, that all other flowers have envied?" said the meek Forget-me-not. "Ah, thou know'st not, simple floweret," said the water-lily then, "that my kinsfolk live in splendour, where are found the haunts of men. One wears a crown imperial, one is royal, the proud fleur-de-lis. A sultan's cap another boasts, and I am, what, alas, for me? I am but Nymphea Alba, only the white maiden of the lake. And what sweeter dearer title could men give, or couldst thou take? But who told thee of thy kindred, and about the homes of men? I have come all down the burnside from the source above the glen, and I have never heard these histories." Then the lily waved with pride, and turned scornfully and proudly from the pale flower at her side. "What shouldst thou know of the great world? Who would care to tell to thee of the lands o'er which they wander, or the wondrous things they see? When the wild geese came last season to encamp beside our lake, one of them came swimming near me. First he bowed, and then he spake. 'Princess,' yes, he called me princess. 'What a dreary lot is thine! I should pine away and perish in a month, if it were mine.' Then he told me of the countries where my noble kinsfolk dwell, in the garden of the Rose Queen, for she loves them passing well. And he said that I was fairer than the fairest of them all, lovelier than the royal lily, though perhaps not quite so tall." "So it was the wild goose told thee of the countries far away? If they are so grand and glorious, had he not there better stay? Do not listen to his gossip, babbler he hath ever been." Then she paused. "See, down the waters comes our lovely fairy queen." "It is well," the lily answered, "I will ask of her a boon, and if granted, in the great world, oh, what joy I shall be soon." When the queen heard her petition, mournfully she turned away, sighing said, "Thy boon, oh, lily, shall be granted in a day." The next morning down the mountains, ere the flowers were half awake, came a man, the first that ever had approached that lovely lake. Eagerly he seized the lily, then for miles and miles he sped, till at last he smiling placed it in a garden fountain's bed. Dark and muddy was the water, thick and sooty was the air, for the smoky giant city blighted all of beauty there. One by one the lily's petals browned and withered ere they spread, and its leaves discoloured, shrivelled, sank within their muddy bed. And the owner of the garden seized and flung it o'er the wall, and amid a bed of nettles did the water-lily fall. There it very soon had perished, but a little boy, I think it might be Cecil, saw and took it to a pretty brooklet's brink, and there threw it in the water, where it grew, but never more did it bloom in snowy beauty, as beside the still lake's shore. End of Part 4. Part 5 of Cecil's Own Book by Anne Hawkshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fairy Gift, or the Iron Bracelets. Once upon a time, that is the way all fairy stories used to begin. Once upon a time there lived a little boy called Fritz. His home was on the banks of the beautiful stream that came tumbling over the rocks at the back of the hut in which he and his grandfather dwelt. For Fritz had no parents, but had always lived with his grandfather, who earned his livelihood by catching fish in the stream
and selling it to the great lords and ladies who lived in the castles in the neighbourhood. When he was not fishing, he cultivated a small garden in which Fritz helped him. That was their work in summer, but after all the vegetables had been stowed away, and the dried fish had been hung up on the rafters of the hut, for it was but a hut in which they lived, though it was always very clean, they sat by the fire during the long evenings, making wooden toys for children. But Fritz never found it dull, for his kind old grandfather told him stories of all the wonderful countries he had seen when he was a young man and a soldier. He taught Fritz to read and to write, as well as to make the little wooden toys which he sold in the spring to the children at the castles around. And Fritz was very obedient to his dear old grandfather, whom he loved very much. He had one pet, a beautiful cat. He had found it one day when it was a kitten, nearly starved and half drowned, for some cruel person had thrown it into the stream. But it had fallen amongst the reeds and rushes near the bank, and so Fritz was able to get it out. It was nearly dead with wet and hunger and fright, but he took it home and gave it some warm milk, and wrapped it up in an old jacket, and put it near the fire. And it soon got well, and grew to be the most beautiful cat that was ever seen in that country, and the cruel man who had thrown it into the stream wanted to buy it, that he might give it to the wife of the great lord under whom he lived, in order to gain her favour. But Fritz would not part with his favourite for any money, though he was poor, and money would have bought him many things he would have liked to have. It happened one day, as Fritz was playing by the side of the stream, he saw something bright glittering in the sun. It was hanging on a reed by the edge of the river, where he was just able to reach it with a little stick he had in his hand. When he got it onto the bank and looked at it, he clapped his hands and quite shouted for joy. It was a small gold girdle, most beautifully made, for it was as soft and flexible as a ribbon, though it was set with the finest diamonds and emeralds and rubies. Fritz knew that they were precious stones, for sometimes when he went to sell fish or toys at the castle, he saw the great lady there, and she wore a girdle round her waist and a circlet on her head, set with pearls that were very beautiful. But they were not to be compared with these. It was not likely that they should be, for this tiny belt belonged to the queen of the fairyland nearest to Fritz's home, and the gnomes of the mountains had been 20 years collecting them for her. But Fritz did not know that till long afterwards. He only thought what a great deal of money he could sell them for, and what a nice cottage he would build for himself and his grandfather, and how he would hire a man to fish and to dig the garden, and let the poor old man rest all the remainder of his life. So he took the beautiful girdle and wrapped it up in his blouse, and ran home as fast as ever he could. His grandfather had gone to a town some miles off to buy twine to make fishing nets of, and would not return that night. So Fritz had no one to show his treasure to but Pussy, who was asleep on his grandfather's easy-chair. He called out as soon as he got into the house. "Wake up, Silky Paws!" That was her name. "Wake up and see what I've found. And when I've sold the gems, you shall have a red collar with a silver bell to it. That you shall, dear old Silky Paws." And Pussy got up and pawed, and opened her great round eyes, and stared as he shook the glittering thing before her. But I do not think she understood anything about it, and would have thought a nice shining fish just caught in the stream a much lovelier sight. For a cat, however handsome and good it may be, can only have a cat's mind and a cat's taste. Finding that Pussy did not care to look at his treasure, he took it into the little closet in which he slept, and put it on the window-seat close to his bed, and then gave Silky Paws her supper, which she liked much better than the fine jewels. It was a beautiful moonlight night, and the last thing Fritz saw before going to sleep was the moonlight streaming through the window and falling on the fairy girdle. He had not been long asleep before he was awakened by someone quite close to him, repeating his name. The voice was very low and sweet, yet it awoke him completely, and he started up in bed and looked in the direction from which the sound came, and in the window-seat where lay the girdle, he saw, standing upon the moonbeam on which she had glided down from Cloudland, where she had been to visit some of her distant relations, the Fairy Queen herself. She was so beautiful and smiled so sweetly that Fritz was not at all afraid, though he had never seen any lady before so very, very small, or dressed in such curious clothes, for her robe was of gossamer worn over a petticoat of the rarest pink rose petals. Her mantle was of the richest purple heartsease, trimmed with the white silky down of the marsh cotton grass, necklace of dewdrops with a photograph suspended from it of the Fairy King, done on water by a new process, headdress of hummingbird plumes, train of the phosphorescence of the sea, a perfectly new discovery of the court milliners, hair powdered with stardust to give the fashionable tint. I know I am quite correct about her costume, for it had appeared in the Fairy Court Journal just before. Fritz waited respectfully for her to speak first, and at length she said, after looking at the girdle at her feet, "I have come, little boy, to ask you to give me back the girdle that you found by the river today, for it is mine." Fritz ventured to say, "But, madam, who told you I had found it? There was no person near when I took it off the reeds." "Oh," she replied, "I do not need mortals to tell me what I want to know. I am the Fairy Queen, and I understand the language of the birds and the insects and the flowers and the trees, and I ask them when I want to know anything. A kingfisher who was standing on a stone in the middle of the river, watching for minnows, saw me drop my girdle as I was floating past to visit my cousins in Sunset Land. As it was nothing he could eat, the greedy creature, he told the water ouzel about it, and he, glad to have a bit of news to repeat, told it to the skylark, who was just quitting her nest to take her daily exercise high up in the soft evening air, and she waited to tell me as I came down, for though she flies high, she cannot reach Cloudland as we fairies can. But when I came to the river, my girdle was gone, so I inquired of the reeds what had become of it, but the reeds are more clever at singing or sighing than observing, and they sung something of which the only words I could distinguish were 'Lost, lost, lost.' So I turned from them to the bright, wide-awake yellow water-lilies that keep their heads above water and their eyes open, and they told me at once that the little boy Fritz, who lived in the hut close by, had taken it away. Fritz thought, 'I will pull up those tattling water-lilies to-morrow and throw them on the bank for telling,' but he did not dare to say so, and it was wrong of him to want to keep the jewel now that he knew to whom it belonged. But you see, it was a great temptation for him to wish to keep it, for he was very poor, and wished so much to get nice things for his old grandfather. But it was only for a moment or two that these bad thoughts remained in his mind, and he took up the girdle and held it to the fairy, saying, 'It is yours. I must not keep what is not my own.' Then she smiled very pleasantly on him, and clasped it round her waist, and said, 'I will leave you a gift which you must never part with until you are a very old man.' And then she glided up the moonbeam and was gone. When she was out of sight, Fritz jumped out of bed to see what she had left him instead of the beautiful belt, and he was very much disappointed and ready to cry when he saw it was only an iron bracelet. It was made with great care, but still it was only iron. He threw it down on the ground at first, but after a while he thought, 'The Fairy Queen would not give me a thing that was worthless. She is too good to ridicule and insult me when I have given her back the girdle she prizes so much. I will do as she told me, and put this bracelet on and never part with it till I am a very old man, too old to work.' So Fritz clasped it on his right arm and fell asleep again, and dreamed wonderful dreams of gold and gems hidden in the mountains, of which he was filling a basket, when, with tremendous noise, a side of the cavern fell down, and a door made all of one diamond flashed on him, and he awoke with a great start, and found the morning sun shining full on his face through the little window, and his grandfather knocking with his big oak stick on the door. Then Fritz jumped up quickly and opened the door for the old man, who wondered to have found him asleep after the sun had risen, for he did not know the boy had been kept awake in the night talking to the fairy. Now it happened some weeks after this that the old fisherman died, and Fritz was left all alone in the hut, with no one in the whole world to care for him. And after the people in the valley had buried his grandfather, he sat down by the fire very sad, wondering what he must do. At last he determined to go to the castle and ask if they would give him work. He did not mind how hard he worked, if he could only earn enough to buy him food and clothing, for he was strong and hated to be idle. But during that night a terrible thunderstorm came on, and the river, swollen by the heavy rain, overflowed its banks, and the water began to pour into the hut, and at the same time a flash of lightning set fire to the thatch. Poor Fritz had only just time to escape through the window, and began to scramble up the rocky hill at the back of the house, when he saw Silky Paws near the door, who was so terrified at the sight of the water that she could not move for fear, but stood on a stone, mewing piteously. Fritz saw her from the place he had climbed to, and could not bear to watch his poor favourite perish. So he slid down the hill again and waded to where she was. He was only just in time to save her, for the water was commencing to wash over the stone on which she stood, and in a few minutes she would have been drowned. The water reached now as high as Fritz's knees, and he sometimes feared he should be washed away, but he struggled on, and at last got to the top of the hill, and sat down to rest. The sun had just risen, and Fritz took off his wet clothes and spread them on a rock to dry. And then he looked round to see if there was any way for him to cross the valley, but he could discover none. It looked like a great lake instead of the fertile place he knew so well. All the corn had been washed away, and great trees torn up by the roots. The torrents were dashing down with a frightful noise, and soon he saw his old home, where he had been so happy for years, washed down and whirled away by the roaring waters. From the top of the rocky hill, up which Fritz with difficulty climbed, stretched a wild desolate plain, covered with broken masses of stone, among which grew here and there furze bushes, tufts of heather, and some plants of bilberries, whose fruit was then ripe. It was a dreary prospect Fritz had to look at, when the sun was high enough in the sky for him to see objects distinctly. On one side the roaring foaming waters, twirling round the uprooted pine trees that had got fast together in great heaps, or bearing onward fragments of peasants' cottages that had been washed away. On the other side of him, further than his eye could reach, lay the barren pathless heath, quite unknown to him, but which was nevertheless his only way of safety. But he was a brave boy, and had been accustomed to a life of hardship, so when the sun had dried his clothes he put them on, and taking Pussy under his arm he started off. In the pocket of his jacket he found a piece of bread, and when he was tired with walking he sat down on the dry heather, and having gathered some bilberries made a hearty meal. At least he thought it one. Silky Paws sat on a stone in the sunshine, purring so contentedly that I suspect she had found a dinner off a field mouse or a little bird. However, I cannot be sure about that. At all events, she did not seem to want any of her masters. Then they trudged on again, and after some hours' walking they found a narrow footpath. The sight of it cheered Fritz, for he thought rightly that it must lead to some dwelling, and so it did. After a while it became wider and more trodden, and just as it began to grow dark, he saw before him a bright light, such a light as he had never seen before. His grandfather had told him of burning mountains that he had seen when he was in distant countries, and at first he thought the flames he saw shooting up to the dark sky must come from a volcano. But as he drew nearer, he saw it was not a mountain, but a large building that was before him, and the fire came from large furnaces. He crept slowly and quietly to the door and peeped in. He saw a number of men watching the iron that was being smelted in the furnaces, big strong men, with faces and hands very black indeed. Fritz was at first rather frightened when he saw them, but he had become very cold and hungry, and so at last he ventured in, and asked very humbly if he might warm himself near one of the fires. One of the men asked him gruffly what he wanted and where he came from. So he told them his sad little story, and showed them his beautiful pussy, who had jumped out of his arms and was sitting winking with her large green eyes at the great fire. The men, though they were rough in manners and had loud voices, were not unkind in heart, and one of them, who had a boy about the age of Fritz, who had gone to be a sailor, and who was then far away on the seas, felt pity for the poor friendless boy, and said, "Here, my lad, sit down on this old rug and rest yourself, and you shall have some supper, for I will answer for it that you are ready for a good meal, for a crust of bread and bilberries makes but a poor dinner." The tears came into Fritz's eyes at such unlooked-for kindness, and he sat down by the fire and ate his supper, and the good man gave some to Silky Paws, and then told Fritz he might sleep there if he did not meddle with anything, which he promised not to do, and soon he was fast asleep. The next morning the master of the workmen came, and seeing Fritz, asked who he was, and having heard his story, said he might stay and work for him. At this Fritz was very glad, and though at first he was rather awkward and often got scolded, he tried so hard to do right, and was so wishful to please everybody, and was so truthful and honest, that he became a great favourite with the men, and with their master too. Everyone liked him, except one surly, dark-browed man, who was indeed a thief, though no one suspected him of being one. The reason he hated Fritz so much was that one day when he was hiding some pieces of metal which he intended to take away when it was dark, Fritz came by the place, and the bad man thought the boy must have seen what he was doing, and would perhaps tell of him. He could not, however, be quite sure that Fritz did see him, or I am afraid he would have taken some cruel means to have got rid of him that very night, but settled in his own mind that he would soon get rid of the poor stranger. Now it happened that Fritz had not seen what the man was doing, and was besides so honest himself that he never thought of suspecting others of stealing. So for some time everything went on as usual, but one morning there was a great consternation at the foundry. The men and boys were talking together in groups, and the master was in earnest conversation with Fritz's enemy in a distant part of the works. Fritz asked one of the boys what was the matter, who answered him very rudely, "Oh, you'll know soon enough, little hypocrite," and then turned away from him. At that instant the man who had been first kind to him came up, and with grave and sad face told him to come along, the master wanted him. When he came to where the master was, he was told, in a stern voice, that he must instantly quit the works, and if it had not been for the entreaties of your good friend, who is one of my best and most honest workmen, I should have sent you to prison, you ungrateful, thievish boy," said the master. Poor Fritz was quite amazed, and for some time could not speak, but at last asked in a trembling voice what he had done wrong. "Perhaps you do not call it wrong to steal. Look at these things," and he showed him several valuable articles. One, a hunting knife, beautifully chased and enamelled, the master had lost some weeks before, and thought he had dropped it on his way home from the works at night. Fritz looked at the things, but did not understand any better than before what it all meant. When turning, he saw the eyes of the real thief fixed on him with a look of hatred, while a wicked smile was on his face, as he said to the poor boy, "Oh, my fine lad, you do not know these pretty things, nor how they got into your box tied up in an old handkerchief. They did not walk in of themselves, did they? Or maybe you will say Mrs. Silky Paws put them there. Cats do quite as queer things as that, if all is true that the cooks say about them."
And then he gave a cruel little laugh, which made poor Fritz's heart sink within him. "Indeed, indeed, I do not know how these things got into my box, sir," he said humbly but firmly to his master. But no one believed him, and his master told him to be gone instantly, to take his clothes and be off in 10 minutes, or he should go to prison. Before the 10 minutes were past, with his little bundle in his hand, and Silky Paws walking solemnly beside him, as if she knew he was in sorrow, poor Fritz again set out on his wanderings. His heart almost burst with indignation when the boys shouted and sneered at him as he passed. But what brought the tears into his eyes was not their rudeness, but it was to see his kind old friend shake his head mournfully as he went by, for Fritz had hoped till then that he at least would not believe him to be a thief. When he had got out of sight, he sat down on a stone and cried, and thought how forlorn and desolate he was. But that did not last long. "It is better to be wrongfully blamed," he said to himself, "than to be suffering now in my own mind for having done wrong. I have the fairy's gift yet, and somehow I think as long as I have that, I shall not starve or be very unhappy." So Fritz took up Pussy, and putting a short stick through his bundle, he swung it on his shoulder and began to ascend a steep rocky hill. He was soon miles away from the foundry. He felt more cheerful as he went along. The day was fine, and the air that came blowing over the wide stony plain he had now reached was pure and bracing, and now he felt what a good thing it was that he had not been brought up in a life of idleness and luxury. The homely provisions in his bundle tasted delicious as he sat on a stone at noon by a mountain stream eating his dinner, while Pussy sat washing her face with her paws and looking very contented, for she had shared her master's meal, and I have no doubt cats take a more cheerful view of cat life when they have had a nice plentiful dinner, and most little boys and girls are like them in that respect. One cannot be very merry if one be very hungry. Refreshed with his dinner and rest, Fritz started again, but the further he went, the wilder the country grew. He was on a great plain strewn with huge pieces of rock, and full of noisy dashing streams that came down from the mountains that bounded his view. After walking a long time, he came to a narrow valley which formed an opening in the hills, and down which roared a wide deep river. He kept walking along the side of the water for some hours, and as night was coming on and he saw no sign of any human being, for the first time he began to be afraid he should die of hunger and cold in that desolate place. Just as the twilight was darkening into night, and the stars were one after another peeping through the clear dark blue sky, he suddenly came to the end of the valley. The mountains, far too high for him to climb, walled it in, and the river on whose banks he had been walking came down them with a noise like thunder, and which he had thought as he came up the valley was thunder. Down it rushed from ledge to ledge of rock, foaming and dashing as it had done for thousands of years. He saw there was no getting out of the valley that way, and with a sigh turned round to retrace his steps, when what was his astonishment and terror to see no outlet now at the other end. It seemed as if the mountains had suddenly closed and fastened him in. Now he was really terrified, and the old Eastern stories his grandfather used to tell him of wicked jinns and efreets came into his mind, and he thought some of them must have got out of the bottles in which Suleiman the Wise had fastened them up,
to hinder them from doing evil, and they have come to live in this dismal place, and will make a slave of me, and perhaps will kill poor Silky Paws. Oh, what shall I do?" And for a while he wrung his hands in despair and cried bitterly, but catching a sight of his bracelet, his courage revived. "The good and beautiful fairy," he said to himself, "would never have given me this if it was not to be of some use to me. It must be a talisman against all the horrors of this place, or of the creatures that are in it. I will walk quite to the end of the valley and see what is there." He did so, and found in the side of the mountain a large cavern, and going into it saw a passage from it into another but smaller cave, into which he went, intending to sleep there, and there to try in the morning to find some opening through the mountains. So putting his little bundle under his head for a pillow, he fell asleep. He was very tired and hungry, but he did not eat the piece of bread he had left, because he knew he should want it still more in the morning. He had not been asleep long before he was awakened by a strange noise that seemed to come from some cavern near him. It was a sound of hammers. At first he thought he had been dreaming of working in the foundry, but listening a short time, he became certain it proceeded from some place near him. It was now evening and twilight outside, but the cave in which he had taken shelter was quite dark. He raised his head and then saw at a great distance a light that looked scarcely bigger than a star, and the hammering came from that side. He got up and felt with his hands all round the cave till he came to an opening he had not noticed before. It was an archway in the rock, and led into a longer and loftier passage than the one he had come by, and at the end he saw the light gleaming and heard the noise more distinctly. Feeling his way along the side of the passage very carefully, he came at last to a small but beautiful arch made of rock crystal, to which the fire inside gave the appearance of ruby. Fritz was very much astonished, and looked cautiously into the cavern, to which the crystal arch was the entrance. And there a wonderful sight met his eyes. The cavern was of great size and very lofty, and many smaller ones opened into it, and before each of these hung curtains of woven gold with borders of glittering gems. Fritz thought they were pieces of coloured glass when he saw them first, but he afterwards learned they were precious stones found in the middle of the mountains. In the large cavern were many little furnaces. It was from the fires underneath these that the light he had seen came from, though high above his head, swinging by golden chains, was a very large lamp of the clearest crystal, in which rock oil was always burning. But it was not these strange sights that amazed him the most. It was the curious little beings who were busy working at the furnaces, poking at the fires, or taking up ladles full of the melted metal, to see if it was ready to work. They had big heads, short bodies, and little crooked legs, and they laughed and chattered so much that they never heard Fritz's footsteps. And he was so surprised at what he saw, and at the funny appearance of the gnomes, that he could not help laughing. At last one of them began to dance round and round, waving his ladle over his head, and he looked so comical that Fritz could restrain himself no longer, but burst into a loud laugh which the echoes of the cavern repeated, till it seemed as if a dozen Fritzes were laughing. Immediately there was a profound silence, and poor Fritz was frightened at what he had done, and sorry at being so rude. Therefore, mustering all his courage, he walked into the middle of the cavern, and taking off his cap, made a very low bow to the gnomes, who had all left their fires and were standing together in a group. "Who are you, and how did you get into the regions of the King of the Gnomes?" said one. Then Fritz told them his story, to which they listened very attentively. "We must take you to the king, and he will know whether your story of the Fairy Queen's gift is true or not, for he is a great friend of hers, and he is acquainted with the sort of gifts she bestows on mortals." It is about time for supper, so we will leave off work and take you to his Majesty." Then each one went behind one of the golden curtains to wash and dress, and they told Fritz where he could find some water to do the same, and by the time the gnomes were ready, he had put on his best clothes. And the little dwarfs seemed quite to approve of him, for he was a handsome, good-natured boy, and they nodded their big heads and smiled as much as to say, "We think he will do." Then they told him to follow them, and they passed behind the largest curtain that hung at the upper end of the cave. The cavern they now entered was entirely made of crystals of all colours. In the middle was a small fountain of pale green malachite, full of the clearest and purest water. At the end of the cavern sat the king of the gnomes, on a throne of gold, made in the shape of a dragon. Its body made the seat, the 2 wings made the sides, and the scaly turned-up tail the back, and on the head with its wide open mouth the funny gnome king rested his little feet. He had a sceptre that looked exceedingly like a shovel, and the shape of his crown was so much like the top of a pair of tongs that Fritz could not help thinking that the good dwarfs had borrowed the patterns for their regalia from the fire-irons. Indeed, I believe the mischievous little fellows thought it was a good joke to make their sovereign have for ornament what they had for use. Before the king was a table made of lapis lazuli, covered with dishes from which came very savoury odours that made poor Fritz feel 10 times more hungry than before. There was a great flagon of wine in the middle of the table, and beautiful cups placed by each plate. They were all alike except the king's. He had a goblet that blazed with rubies. All the plates and dishes, indeed everything on the table, was of gold and of the oddest forms. One great dish was like a turtle, and when you took off the upper part you found it was full of turtle soup. Another was like an ostrich egg in the middle of a dish of sand. It was not sand, but gold dust that had an omelette in it. The salt cellar was in the shape of a nautilus shell. The pepper box was the head of a man sneezing, as if he had got some of the pepper up his nose, and the vinegar cruet was like a very thin woman with such a long spiteful cross face that one of the gnomes, as soon as they were seated at table, turned it round and hid it with the oil flask, which was a jolly fat little puck with a basket of ripe olives. "The sight of that vinegar face would take away my appetite," said the gnome, laughing. "It was made, you must know, Master Fritz, by my brother yonder when he had a fit of indigestion from eating too many brandy balls, into which pounded diamonds had been put for loaf sugar." Fritz looked very much astonished at any cook, even in Gnomeland, making such an odd mistake. He had not learned what joking fellows the gnomes were. But before they sat down to supper, they all went and bowed to the king, one after another. At last came Fritz, rather frightened. "Oh, ho," said his Majesty, "whom have we here? How have you found your way to my dominions without a guide? I have sent no one lately up to that fool's land you come from, so you could not have had anyone to show you the way down here, young master." Then Fritz, bowing very low, told his story. All the dwarfs stood round him and looked very pitiful, and hoped that the king would believe him as they did. "Let me look at the bracelet," said the king. So Fritz showed it to him. "All right," exclaimed his Majesty. "I have known that for many a year. The Fairy Queen will want it back some day. It has come through many hands already. I dare say that the respectable old antediluvian Tubal Cain, who worked like us in metals, had it once on his brawny arm. But now it is time to sup, and the smell of that soup is enough to give anyone an appetite without a 24 hours fast like thine, Fritz." Then they sat down, and such a merry party they were. How they did laugh and told such funny stories of the tricks they had played ill-natured people, when they went up on the earth. They never teased the kind and good ones. "We will pay off thy old enemy some day, Fritz," said one of them, but he answered that he had rather they would help the workman who had been so good to him. "Oh, thou shalt do that thyself some day, if thou canst keep thy bracelet," said the king. Fritz thought it was very unlikely that he should ever be able to assist anyone, but as it would have been unpolite for a boy like him to contradict the Gnome King, he contented himself with thinking it only. At last this merry supper was over, and as Fritz was wondering who would clear away the things, and was going to offer to do it himself, he saw the table move itself gently on one side. A table running about was not at all a wonderful thing down in Gnomeland, but as Fritz did not live in our country, and had never heard of Mr. Home, he was very much astonished. As soon as the table was on a nice slope, all the dishes began to move off. The great soup dish went flapping and floundering away first. Then the omelette dish rolled off, but went so fast that it knocked over a neat little frog dish that was hopping quite gracefully away. The fowl dishes flew off, so they could have done without the table being tilted. The cruet tumbled head over heels, as if he were a real Robin Goodfellow. The pepper and mustard went one after the other sulkily, and the sour-faced vinegar cruet marched off alone. The salt cellar sailed past her without notice. You see, these 5 were often compelled to be together against their inclinations. Indeed, they had often to be beaten to make them agree at all. When all had gone off to the pantry, the table turned itself upside down, slowly ascended to the top of the cave, and rested there till it should be wanted again next day. How very convenient it would be in small London rooms if the furniture would put itself away as it does in Gnomeland, and give people a little more space at evening parties. When the table was gone, Fritz saw a gold couch walk in from a cavern behind the king's seat, which was indeed his dressing room, but it was so small that he could only use it after the couch had come out. As soon as the couch had jumped and wriggled itself into the front of the throne, all the dwarfs bowed to the king and went to bed, and Fritz with them. And in 10 minutes he was fast asleep, which was well for him, or the snoring of his majesty might have kept him awake. The gnomes were used to it, and snored in a lower key. So ended Fritz's first evening in the cave of the gnomes. The next morning, before breakfast, the dwarfs began to work. They were making a gold dinner service for the Fairy Queen, and as the time for her annual visit was drawing near, they were working very hard to get it finished before her arrival. Fritz stood and watched them for some time, and then offered to do anything he could to help them. He thought he could do some of the coarser parts of the manufacture, and at least he said, "I can attend to the fires." So every day for many months he lived with them, and they taught him to work in metals, and as he was intelligent and industrious, he soon became a skilful workman, and was happy and contented. But sometimes he sighed and said to himself that he should like to go up to his own world again after a while. But he did not say it to the kind little dwarfs, fearing they might think him ungrateful for all their goodness to him. At last the dinner set, which was to be a present from the King of the Gnomes to the Queen of the Fairies, was finished, and very beautiful it was. You, I dare say, if you had seen it, would have thought it a doll's dinner service, it was so small. But it was quite large enough for fairies, they are so tiny, you know. The plate chests were made of ivory, bound with bands of gold and lined with quilted satin. A beautiful salamandrian had done that for the gnomes, because they could not sew. She was a great friend of theirs, and often came to see them when the weather was warm, for she could not bear cold, as you may imagine when I tell you that she lived inside a volcano, and instead of water to bathe in, used fire, just sitting down in the flames when she thought she wanted a bath. Fritz was very anxious to see her. He had heard the dwarfs talk so much about her goodness and wonderful beauty. And one day when he had made a very bright fire, and the flames were blazing up by a fissure in the rock that served for a chimney, he saw a lovely creature come gliding through them, and then sit down on the edge of the furnace, where the gold was bubbling and hissing. He knew at once that it must be the salamandrine come to see her friends. As soon as they saw her, they all crowded round to welcome her, and invited her to come down and sit near the king. "You shall have your own chair of state near his throne," they said to her. "We will put some burning charcoal in the asbestos cushions to make it comfortable. But we cannot join you up there on the furnace," they said, laughing. She wore a robe of changeable colour. Sometimes it looked like flame, sometimes blue, like the beautiful colours you see in the fire on a frosty night. Her girdle was of diamonds, and she had a band of diamonds on her head, and her long golden hair fell in ringlets on her shoulders. She was tall and slender, and all her movements were graceful, like the flames when they bend and waver round a burning piece of wood. Fritz stood gazing at her with wonder and delight. He had never seen anything so lovely in his life before. And the little dwarfs seemed as if they would kneel down and worship her. She smiled very sweetly, and then said,
"Thanks, kind friends. I will come down, though this seat is certainly very warm and pleasant. But I want to chat with the king, and I have brought you some metal ready melted. I found it near my drawing-room fire yesterday. The fires in my home are rather large, you know, and as they have been burning a few thousand years, the place is comfortably aired by this time."
The gnomes laughed and said they thought it must be so. Then she stepped down and walked towards the king, 4 of them carrying her chair, which was a large piece of furniture for them to carry, and had taken them a long time to make. But they thought nothing a trouble that they could do for their favourite. The little king jumped up in such a hurry when he saw the salamandrine coming, that he let his sceptre fall and knocked his crown all awry. She smiled, and after she and the king had shaken hands, she sat down in her chair of state and told him what was going on in the volcano in which she had her palace, and about her last visit to Iceland to see her relations, who lived in Mount Hekla, and of the delicious baths she had while there in the hot springs. Then refreshments were brought, but the wine was so hot that the poor king scalded his tongue while drinking her health, but she sipped it and said it was delicious. Then she examined the fairy queen's dinner service and admired it very much, but said gold dishes would not do for her. They would melt in her warm kitchen. Even her crystal was often cracked with the heat. Then, bidding them all good-bye, she stepped onto the furnace and ascended with flames through the fissure in the rocks. The beautiful fire spirit had scarcely gone away before a noise was heard in the long passage leading to the caverns. "What can that be?" said Fritz. "It sounds like the buzzing of bees." And he went to the entrance to look, and who should he see but the good fairy queen and all her train. Such a long procession, but all so small. First came 6 outriders mounted on wasps, which they had tamed and rendered gentle. Then the queen in her pearl chariot, drawn by 8 dragonflies, whose beautiful gauzy wings of blue and green and gold made the buzzing noise Fritz had heard, and they flew swiftly along with the carriage. They were difficult steeds to drive, but the coachman could keep them in order, troublesome as they were. He was a cunning old mosquito from Java, and if they would not obey him, he would just let them feel his sting, which did better than a whip. The footmen were butterflies. There would not have been room for 3 to stand, but they kept their wings shut when behind their mistress, and only showed their gorgeous liveries when they flew down to open the chariot door with their antennae, for the queen to alight. The damp would have spoiled their feather coats, so it was convenient for 2 reasons. It saved Her Majesty the expense of waterproof overcoats and carriage umbrellas. After the royal chariot came 6 more, each with 4 small dragonflies to draw them, filled with the lords and ladies in waiting, and then a long train of little covered waggons formed of some kind of nut, drawn by slow hard-working beetles. Squirrel and Company were the Queen's cartwrights. I just name it as a sort of advertisement for that active firm. As soon as Fritz saw who was coming, he ran quickly to tell the gnomes, and then there was a hurry-scurry to get everything in order for the reception of Her Majesty of Fairyland. One ran to tell the King, who was taking his nap after dinner, and shake him awake, and then put on his crown properly and straighten out his robe. Others began to arrange the gold dinner service for the Queen to inspect. Royal people always inspect things, they do not look at them like ordinary men and women, at least the newspapers say so. Some hurried away to put on their best clothes, and told Fritz to do the same. 1 or 2 tumbled over each other in their haste, and what with running, tumbling, screaming and laughing, there had not been such a hurly-burly in Gnomeland for many a day. However, just as the outriders came up to the door with a buzz and a flourish, all was ready, and the dwarfs standing in 2 rows at the entrance, the King came to within 6 inches and a half of the archway, and stood until the carriage door was opened, and then advanced and offered his hand to lead the Queen to the throne, prepared for her on the right side of his. You will wonder perhaps how they knew court ceremonials so correctly, living down in their underground country so much, and never having been presented at a drawing-room. But the Queen's Chamberlain had sent them a book of court etiquette he had written. It was considered by his friends a masterpiece, for it regulated to within half an inch the distance each person was to approach Her Majesty, and the number of words they might use in answering her questions. The gnomes had much fun about this book, but sometimes one would pretend to be the Queen and would say, "What do you think of the weather?" And then they would look in the book for the proper number of words to reply to it. One would give too many, another too few, and then they laughed till the cavern echoed with their merriment, and then their jolly little King would call out to know what they were so merry about, and they had to act it over again before him, and he would laugh as loudly as the rest, for you see they lived down there more like one family than like a court and a king and subjects. Well, at last the Queen was seated, and her people standing behind her. The King told the dwarfs to bring in the chests of plate, and after they had been inspected by Her Majesty, they were taken to the waggons and put in. Then she very gracefully thanked the gnomes for the trouble they had taken in making such beautiful things, and the King for his costly gift. After that she ate some preserved rose-leaf, and tasted the conserve of violets, and sipped some dissolved dewdrops, and then prepared to return to her own country. But before she left, the King sent for Fritz, whom the Queen recollected at once, and pointing to the bracelet said, "Thou must keep that for many years yet. I can bestow many gifts on mortals, but none equal to thine, Fritz." Then she and her long train departed, and things went on as usual, till Fritz had grown to be a tall, strong young man, and a very skilful workman. One day the King sent for him and all the dwarfs, and said, "It is time now that thou shouldest return to thine own land. We shall miss thee, good Fritz, but thou must come to see us sometimes, and bring us any news of what the mortals are doing up there, and whether they are getting any wisdom into their dull heads." Fritz was glad to hear that he might return to the upper world, though very sorry to leave his kind, merry little friends. "But how am I to find my way down to you again?" he asked. Then they told him that in a lonely place they described to him on the moor that he knew, there was a rock that looked like the tower of a castle, and behind it was a flat smooth stone, which, when struck with a hammer, gave out a metallic sound. "When you want to visit us," they said, "you must strike that stone with your hammer, and it will be lifted up like a trap-door, and you will see a flight of stone steps. You must come down them, and you will arrive here." And they showed him a little opening in the king's dressing-room, which he had never seen, because a curtain was always hung before it. "You need not bring a light," they said, "for the rock oil has been burning there for years, and lightens the passage beautifully." "And now," said the king, "let us have the best supper you can give, and some of our oldest wine to drink to the success of friend Fritz, otherwise Baron von Arbeit." So they had a merry supper, and the next morning Fritz took his leave with tears in his eyes, and many thanks for all their goodness to him. 2 of the gnomes took him up the secret staircase, and when they got to the top, they struck the stone with their hammers. And it opened, and Fritz saw he was on the moor where the foundry was, where he used to work. When he looked round to say farewell to his good little friends, they were not to be seen, and the stone was in its place again. But he carefully observed everything around that he might know it again, for it would have made him very sad indeed to think he should never see the kind gnomes and their merry crooked-legged king any more. He sat down beside the rock, thinking for a long time, and rather bewildered, for the earth and sky were unfamiliar to him now. At length, as he saw by the sun it was noonday, he rose and walked in the direction of the foundry. When he came in sight of it, he was surprised to see no smoke coming out of the chimneys, and on going up to it he found it was deserted, the fires all gone out, and not a living thing to be seen. Fritz then went to find the hut in which the kind workman lived who had been his friend when he had no other in the world. He found him digging in his little garden, but the place looked very desolate. There was scarcely any furniture in the hut, and no fire on the hearth, and the poor children were all huddled together on some straw, trying to keep each other warm. When Hans, that was the name of the father, saw Fritz, he took off his old cap and made a low bow. But Fritz ran up to him and said, "Do you not know me, my dear old friend? I am Fritz." The man stared without speaking. He was so astonished at the change in Fritz, who had grown into a strong, handsome young man. At last Fritz convinced him who he was, and then, saying he would return soon, walked as fast as he could to the nearest town, where he hired a cart and put into it plenty of food and clothing, and beds for the poor children, with a pile of wood for a fire and a bottle of good wine for Hans, who was almost worn out with poverty and hard work. Oh, what rejoicing there was when the cart stopped at the door, and one big basket after another was carried into the hut. The children helped to make the fire, and Hans cooked the supper, and Fritz poured out the wine into a cup of gold of his own designing that the dwarfs had given him at parting. And then they sat down, Fritz on a cask turned upside down, and Hans on an old wheelbarrow, the 2 boys and 3 girls on billets of firewood, and the huge fire they had made blazed up the chimney and gave them plenty of light, and the big logs crackled and the children laughed, and Hans and Fritz talked together. And I think they were as merry as the dwarfs and Fritz the first night he supped in the cavern. Then the children arranged their beds, and felt so deliciously comfortable in warm blankets that they soon went to sleep. But Fritz and Hans sat talking by the fire for many hours, for they had long histories to tell each other. Fritz told his wonderful adventures first, and then Hans told him how nothing at the foundry prospered after he was turned away. For the master believed all the lies the bad workmen told him, and all the best men and boys went away, and at last it had to be deserted, and was to be sold. But no one would buy it, and everything had gone to ruin. "I will purchase it," said Fritz, "and you shall be my partner." The good little gnomes had given Fritz plenty of gold, so the next day he bought the foundry and all the moor round it, and Hans soon collected plenty of the old men and boys to work, and the great fires blazed again in the furnaces, and the workmen had nice cottages and gardens, and everyone was contented and happy. And so things went on for many years. And Fritz married Gretchen with the golden hair and blue eyes, the eldest daughter of Hans, and he built a beautiful chateau and was called Baron von Arbeit. You must not think that he ever forgot his kind old friends in the mountain. He often went to see them and never came back without some beautiful jewels for his wife or a fine cup for his boys. And so years passed, and Fritz and Gretchen were keeping their golden wedding, and all their children and grandchildren were assembled at the castle, and the work people were having a great feast at the works. The master and mistress sat in 2 high-backed chairs on a dais at the end of the great hall, and their relations and friends stood near them, and in the middle of the hall was a large table, on which were put all the beautiful cups and dishes the gnomes had given Fritz. They had made him one for that day expressly. On one side was a young man working in a field, on the other an old man sitting under a tree, and round the rim of the cup was written, "At eventide rest." When all were assembled, Fritz and Gretchen stood up, and their eldest son brought them the golden wedding cup full of wine, and they drank the health of all their sons and daughters, and of their grandchildren, and their relations and friends. And when they said friends, they smiled to each other, for they remembered their kindest of all friends, the good little gnomes of the mountain. And they knew by the designs and the motto on the cup that the time had come for Fritz to take off the bracelet he had worn so long, and that the gnomes would fetch it that night to return it to the Fairy Queen. So dear beautiful old Gretchen with the silver hair now unclasped the iron armlet and laid it on the table, and they saw inside the words Truth and Industry. End of Part 5. Part 6 of Cecil's Own Book by Anne Hawkshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Change, not death. There was a bright cloud in the west, rosy and golden and at rest. It seemed an island of the blest. I gazed upon it as it lay, and wished it there would ever stay, and never, never melt away. But the sun went down, and each glorious dye faded away from the darkening sky, and I was sad, I knew not why. There was a bird whose pleasant song all day had sounded the reeds among, where the still deep river flowed along. But there came a time when it must fly to warmer lands, or stay and die, when wintry winds swept fiercely by. And one soft warm autumnal day it stretched its wings and flew away, and I heard no more its cheerful lay. There was a plant whose snow-white flower burst into splendour at twilight's hour, and beauty and perfume filled the bower, and when the gazers at midnight came, the queen of the night was still the same, and to gather its blossoms, they said, was shame. So in its beauty they left it there, to fill with scent the midnight air, with the stars to gleam on its petals rare. But in the morning they found it dead, beauty and perfume alike had fled, and a withering mass was there instead. But the glittering sunbeams and the rain many cloud isles will build again, ere another moon shall wax and wane. And the bird will come back from across the sea, when the young buds are bursting on plant and tree, and the air will be filled with its melody. And the summer sun will revive the flower, and beauty and perfume fill the bower, from the soft calm twilight to midnight hour. Thus life and death go on for ever, naught may the twofold cord dissever. 'Tis change unceasing, destruction never. Earth's Waters. Which of all earth's waters dost thou love the best? The stream that runneth softly by the water ouzel's nest, or the wide and solemn river that telleth not of glee, but of forces irresistible, man cannot stop or flee? Or the quiet pool where groweth the lily and the reed, and where the spotless water birds in the twilight come to feed? Or the mountain lake that mirroreth the eagle as he soars, and the storm clouds as they gather when the mighty thunder roars? Oh, best of all earth's waters, I love the mountain stream. It speaketh to me ever of the past's bright tender dream, when by its dancing waters 5 happy children played, and their ringing laughter mingled with the music that it made. O mountain stream, thou babblest still ever gaily on, the music of that laughter from me and earth has gone. The birds of passage. A sound of countless wings, a dark and wavy line across the sky, and then the birds of passage sped away before the gazer's eye, over the rivers and the pathless sea, o'er the silent desert and o'er the treeless plain, where the scorched grass was crackling in the sun, waiting for autumn rain. Onward still, on they go, nor swerve nor hesitate about their way, and on the self-same path they will return some coming day, and find their former haunts, and build their nests beneath the cottage thatch. The harbingers of sunny days, for them shall village children watch. O wondrous law, that through unnumbered ages naught hath broken, sure as ebb and flow of ocean's wave, unwritten and unspoken. Homes of the Flowers. Upon the mountain's bow the bright blue gentians have their home, buried beneath the drifting snow of many a winter's storm, rooted in desert sand, or on the barren shore and wet by spray. The tamarisk to the lonely wanderer says, "Go hopeful on thy way." The cocoa palm trees wave their pendant leaves above the coral isle, while at their root the insect makers work, tomb and memorial pile. On Afric's arid plains a strange weird plant spreads out its tattered leaves, more like a monster of the deep than aught that life from earth receives. In the dim dripping cave, where sunbeams die in twilight's settled gloom, where the shy seal finds for itself a home, lulled by the sea waves' everlasting boom, grows the bright fern that will not bear a change, or other winds than ocean waves to fan its glossy fronds, but slowly withering dies beside the haunts of man. Upon the ruined tower where feudal banners waved in days of old, the scented wallflower opens to the sun its tufts of brown and gold, while on the chalky cliffs its purple sister shares the beetling height with wearied swallows, resting ere they take to their old haunts their flight. Scarcely a spot of earth but is a home for you, fair gentle things. To the sad exile many a tender thought sight of your beauty brings. O wise and gracious law, that upon matter nature hath impressed, awaking living beauty ceaselessly from earth's dead breast. In Memoriam. Once in a far-off northern home 5 happy children played. They ran beside the mountain streams, and through the pine woods strayed, or watched the wild birds on the hills from morn to evening shade. One made a mill wheel in a stream, another read his book, stretched on the sweet thyme-covered bank, but oft away would look to where his youngest brother fished for minnows in the brook. And ever by the brother's side kept the two sisters dear, and borne upon the mountain breeze their laugh came soft and clear to where the mother sat. Her heart had not then learned to fear, for though within her distant grave one fair young sister slept, though softly still they breathed her name, though still the mother wept, and hid deep in her heart of hearts that pure sweet memory kept. Death is contented with that one, such was the mother's dream. That bud of beauty, will it not my other flowers redeem? Oh, foolish was that mother's thought beside the mountain stream. But then these young lives were so glad, their hearts so good and pure, they filled one home so full of love, it seemed it must endure. For to fill up such void on earth, what solace or what cure? There came a change. Through Highland glen walked quietly but four, or talked with whispered words within the heather-covered bower, or gathered for the sick boy's room green fern or autumn flower. There with fair brow and sunny hair upon his couch he lay, patient and loving to the last, and as he passed away, giving sweet words of love to her who wept in wild dismay. Amid the scenes he loved so well there is a little grave, the giant hills behind it tower, before it cornfields wave, and there with bitter tears they lay to rest their good and brave. Time passed, and then there were but three who wept in speechless woe. The young wife mother, must she die? Oh God, must this be so? It must be but a hideous dream, they could not let her go. Beside the village church a cross tells where that dear one sleeps. Her boy treads gently there, and love untiring vigil keeps. And years go by of good and ill, but still that mother weeps. End of Part 6. End of Cecil's own book by Anne Hawkshaw. Read by Phil Benson.